Hi, welcome. I see some are still trying to connect to audio, so let's just give it a moment. It looks like most are connected, so we're going to get started because we have big a big presentation with very little time. So I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping announcements, and I'll try to do that quick so that Dr. Bryant can have this time and you can have time for questions. So thank you so much for joining us for Advocating for Women Facing Trauma and Oppression, hosted by the Society for Health Psychology's Women's Health Interest Group and co-sponsored by the Society of Clinical Psychology, APA Division 12.
Jessica, you're muted.
Wait, Barbara, we were just talking about that. I'm sorry. And hello and welcome, everybody. I had a big event yesterday and I am catching up. So welcome, everybody. My name is Dr. Jessica Clifton. I'm co-chair of the Women's Health Interest Group. And before we begin, we have a few items to share. I am co-chair along with Dr. Christina Hood, who is on the call. Thank you, Chris. So thank you for joining us, Advocating for Women Facing Trauma and Oppression, hosted by the Society for Health Psychology's Women's Health Interest Group and co-sponsored by the Society of Clinical Psychology for APA Division 12. First, this event and all SFHP virtual presentations are offered as a free benefit of membership in the Society for Health Psychology. If you have not yet joined or renewed for 2023, please do so as soon as possible to ensure unlimited access to future presentations and other society benefits. Visit our website at societyforhealthpsychology.org for more information. This event is being recorded, so anyone who speaks during it, for example, to ask a question, is agreeing to be recorded and is granting permission for the recording to be posted on our website. The webinar is also eligible for 1 continuing education credit under the Society of Clinical Psychology Division 12 sponsorship. CE evaluation information will be sent via email to all who attend the full presentation shortly after the webinar. We will leave the evaluation portal open for 1 week until 5 p.m. Eastern on Thursday, May 18th, 2023. The certificates will be sent via email within 5 to 10 business days after the evaluation period closes, using the email at which you enrolled in this session. All participants are invited to submit feedback via the evaluation, even those not seeking credit. Questions will be taken at the end of the presentation, and you can either submit them via the chat feature or you can use the raise your hand feature and I'll call on you to ask your question directly. And now I am honored to introduce APA President Thema Bryant. Dr. Thema Bryant is currently a tenured professor at the Graduate School of Education and Psychology at Pepperdine University, where she directs the Culture and Trauma Research Laboratory. She has authored and served on the editorial board of several books, book chapters, and peer-reviewed manuscripts. Additionally, she has received numerous awards recognizing her work, including the APA Emerging Leader of Women in Psychology Award for her work on violence against women, and the Sarah Allen Research on the Status of Black Women Award. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Thema Bryant. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. We are women rising high like the phoenix. We are women. From the ashes we rise. From the ashes we rise. From the ashes we rise. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good day, wherever you are. I am so grateful you are here and grateful for this invitation to be with you. And so to our allies and accomplices who have joined us as well, to our sacred siblings, sisters, brothers, and our non-binary siblings, I am grateful for your presence as we think about how we can collectively advocate for women who have experienced trauma and oppression. So I will invite you to take cleansing breath as I share my screen. I know many of us are going from Zoom to Zoom, from meeting to meeting. And so it is so important that we remember ourselves as we are doing this work. And I want to start off with this frame of we want justice, which is why the advocacy piece is so important, that we are not simply looking to medicate people's pain. We are not simply looking to help people to cope with their pain. We are not just looking to help people to tolerate it, but that we actually want to shift atmospheres so that women and girls are able to develop, grow, thrive in safety, and to really attain the fullness of the abundant life. And so to not have trauma of any form, including oppression, cut off our wings or stand on our wings. And so to recognize the importance of the work that you are doing, I want us to take a moment to center in on our own breath. So if it aligns with you, one hand on your heart, one hand on your belly, inhaling in through the nose and exhaling out through the mouth. I want you to know that you are more than your labor, and we appreciate all that you are doing and will do. So I am a lover of words. Lucille Clifton said, "Come and celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed." And Layla Delia says, "She remembered who she was and the game changed." Audre Lorde wrote, "I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own." And there's a Mexican proverb which reads, "They tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds." And so with those quotes, we want to hold both realities, the trauma and the triumph, the pain, the difficulty, the wound, as well as the growth, the flourishing, the meaning. And so as we think about the lives of women, we don't want to overlook the realities of trauma. And at the same time, we want to know that as women, we are so much more than our traumas. So I am glad to speak to you today from a land that's been cultivated by the Tongva peoples, the original stewards of this land, and we recognize their history, culture, contributions, and violations, past and present. I want to name that we are meeting during a socio-political climate where there is much hostility, instability, overt violence, misinformation, and disinformation. I want to name that many who are present have dealt with the realities of COVID-19, have had losses visible and invisible. We are aware of the disparities that exist as it relates to the pandemic as well as other health conditions, and aware that even in the midst of health crises, we continue to face racism and hate crimes. So we want to think about racism and sexism not just as something that happens out there, but something that is also within the field. And so as we consider our organizations, our divisions, and where each of us individually work, as well as our individual lives, often it is so much easier to think about how can we disrupt oppression in systems that we are not connected to. But I invite you to bring it closer to home to say, how might gendered racism, racism and sexism show up in our division, show up in APA, show up in the academy or the clinics and the hospitals in which we work. And I would invite us to resist and reject the myth of neutrality in scholarship. So if you study feminist psychology and other forms of justice-oriented psychology, we would recognize that each of us show up with a worldview. And as soon as we think that our worldview is just what is normative or what is healthy, we have already engaged in biases because we have a lack of self-awareness. So our reflexivity is important. And I want to name along with reflexivity that brings meaning to what we find significant in our research, our teaching, our practice, our applied psychology, and who and what we think matters. So that awareness of what we bring to the table is not a mere stumbling block, but it can be a resource that keeps us motivated to do the work as long as we are operating with awareness and humility. So I invite us as we think about health psychology and the experiences of women to move beyond cultural competence. So cultural competence has been traditionally defined as awareness, knowledge, and skills. And I want to say it is insufficient to simply be aware that racism and sexism exists, but we want to be actively anti-oppression in our engagement. So considering it is not enough for me to acknowledge that racism and sexism exist and that they affect our health, but then I have to go to the next step to say, how will I apply my science, my knowledge, my skills, my resources to the dismantling and the disruption of racism and sexism in women's lives? And it also requires that we show up with cultural humility. Some people with the framework of competence would come to one CE workshop like this one or take one class in graduate school and believe they're done. So they might say, check, I'm culturally competent. But when we think about cultural humility, that is a stance, it is an approach that is ongoing, that recognizing that each of us, including me, will continue to learn from each other. Because as soon as we are closed off and believing that we know it all, then we have missed the opportunity to truly see and hear and appreciate the other voices in the room. So Audre Lorde wrote, "This woman is Black, so her blood is shed in silence." And I invite you to think about whose bloodshed is often silent, whose mistreatment, violation gets more outrage, and whose gets less outrage. Where do we see more victim blaming, and where do we see more victim support as we consider various identities? And so when we think historically the construct of trauma, PTSD was developed thinking about the experience of veterans. So they go to war, they come back, we help them recover post-trauma. And then we expanded that to look at intimate partner violence, to look at molestation. And at first there was pushback of people saying, well, these people haven't been to war. And then the case was made that some people's war is in their childhood bedroom, some occurs in alleyways or in schoolyards. And there was an acknowledgement of the expansion and understanding of the term. We have more recently been advocating for the acknowledgement of collective trauma, intergenerational trauma, the trauma of oppression. And so racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, religious intolerance, xenophobia, all of these can create space for traumatizing occurrences. And the traumas are cumulative or chronic, not acute, so beyond a single incident. And there has been some pushback in the field of recognizing that oppression can be traumatizing. In fact, there are some trauma psychologists who will say that a physical assault is a capital T trauma, but that racism is a lowercase t trauma because it's only emotional. So to anyone who would say it is only emotional, I would say perhaps you haven't been paying attention to the lives that have been taken and the threats to people's lives and well-being and wholeness, especially as we think about discrimination showing up in the medical field and lives actually being jeopardized. When we look at the disparities as it relates to maternal morbidity as we look at the realities and disparities across chronic illnesses and preventable illnesses and consider the additional impact of stress, trauma, and stigma. And so we cannot heal what we will not acknowledge, and it is important for us to acknowledge the wounds of oppression. We want to always be careful about only wanting to open the door for the things that affect us. And as soon as it is about a form of trauma that does not affect us directly, seeking to close the door. So I've heard some people say things like, well, if racism is traumatic, then everything is traumatic. So now the word means nothing and it's going to dilute the word. So we cannot say racism is potentially traumatizing. So we want to be careful about that. There's also pushback from members of marginalized communities who fear the framework of trauma being another opportunity for people to pathologize marginalized persons. And often people who make that argument only want to acknowledge our strengths and our resilience and our possibility and capacity. And to that, I would say we need room to acknowledge both, because if we can only be superheroes, there is a lack of humanity. If we can only talk about ourselves as unmoved by the experiences of life, then we have discarded our humanity for the cloak of super strength. And instead, we need to acknowledge both. We need to have a strengths-based perspective as well as a trauma-informed perspective. It's also important to recognize the realities of vicarious traumatization so that when we see attacks on women, even if you were not the direct target, when you look at the prevalence of violence against women, that has an impact on your meaning making, on your identity, on your nervous system. And so it is both about being a direct target, it is about bearing witness, and it is also about vicarious traumatization and that accumulating over time. So we know with intergenerational trauma, there is the transmission that happens, whether we are talking about in our biology and in our nervous system and in our brains and what gets passed down to the next generation. We also think about socialization, what is taught and what is modeled. And so racism and sexism shows up in our curriculum, what I would call a colonized curriculum. So you think about from your own training, what was the attention that was paid to the experience of women in particular, and then women with intersectional identities, so multiply marginalized women. You want to think about a lack of representation when we consider not just recruitment, but retention. So if you work in a hospital, a clinic, a department where there have been a large exodus of minoritized persons, for us to consider what is happening in these spaces that make them intolerable and unsustainable. We also are mindful of tokenism, where sometimes people want your face for the brochure or for the website, but do not want your voice. And so if we are present but are silent, then we are missing actual representation. We think about the impact of sexual harassment, microaggressions and erasure, violence, being overworked and underpaid. We consider the realities of women in the prison industrial complex and in the injustice system. Many times the narratives of men in that complex are held up, but it's important that we consider the health and well-being of women, and the majority of those women are also mothers, and so their children. And considering when we have strategic planning and statements, value statements that are placed and positioned but are not implemented. So when you consider the values of the division, the values of the association, we want to consider then how do we walk that out? How do we live it out? And we want to think about the lack of dissemination of knowledge beyond the academy. If I spend my career writing articles that only a few people read and a handful of people attend your presentation at a convention, but there is not a translation of your work in applicable ways, then who is it serving? So, us thinking about we can disseminate with policy implications and advocacy. We can disseminate by sharing knowledge in communities and being a bridge with community organizations. And we can share knowledge through media, including social media. So we want to push back on the denial of oppression. We want to recognize systemic failures in policies and procedures because it is important to recognize that oppression in all of its forms is bigger than bias. People often like the term bias because it's gentle, and people will say, well, everyone has biases, and it keeps it on the individual level. And when we think about oppression as merely individual, then often we put the weight of responsibility on the individuals who have been targeted. So then people would say you should just ignore them, don't worry about it, just stay positive, continue to lean in, keep contributing. And that is the advice that often we give children who are bullied or harassed or mistreated, is just ignore them. So it is important to know that sexism is bigger than individual bias, that sexism and other forms of oppression are institutional, are organizational, that they are embedded in every system. So they are unavoidable. That sexism and racism show up in the healthcare system, the educational system, the media. It shows up in every area. It is unavoidable in the financial system. When we look at the wage gaps, when we look at issues of promotion, when we look at who is tenured, all of these dynamics have to be considered as we seek to address it. We also are aware of the adultification of girls of color in particular, that their experiences are often adultified instead of given the compassion and the support that other children are often given. The sexualization and the objectification are also manifestations of this oppression. Transphobia, essentialism and the binary, rigid gender roles, hostile and benevolent sexism, health disparities, and the continued legalization of an unlivable minimum wage, as well as the feminization of the profession, that as more women enter a field or a specialty, the less pay is received. So we think about the effects of oppression in its various forms, societal trauma, and the trauma of oppression. And the effects can create depression, anxiety, anger, PTSD, distrust, suicidal thoughts, substance dependence, fatigue, dissociation, somatic complaints. So it's migraines and nausea and backache, difficulty focusing, and it shows up in practical manifestations with barriers to economic, educational, and political resources and advancement. It also shows up in our physical bodies, increased risk of death, injury, infection, cardiovascular disease, respiratory system failure, COVID-19 initially, after the vaccine that shifted in terms of the racial disparities because racially marginalized persons were getting vaccinated at higher rates, birthing complications, and a big part that we often leave out in our field are the spiritual effects. So research demonstrates that mental health professionals are less likely to endorse spirituality than the general public. So you largely have people who do not endorse a faith creating the healing models for people who do endorse a faith, and that faith being erased or pathologized. So we want to be holistic in our efforts, and many people who are working in hospitals recognize the overlap and the important connection between the mental health support and the support offered by hospital chaplains. So we want to be holistic in our interventions and in our research to understand mind, body, heart, and spirit. So there are negative effects of sexism, including the internalization of racist beauty ideals among women of color, and that can result in distress. It can affect sexual well-being, so not having satisfaction in our sexual lives or not feeling comfortable and confident using condoms, as well as negative body image. And so for each of you, I invite you to think about what were the images of beauty that not only were put before you in your developmental stages, but are put before you now, and how often do you see your reflection, and what is the impact of seeing your reflection or not seeing your reflection, even as we consider ageism, as we consider ableism as well. So liberation psychology originated from Latin America. It is grounded in the recognition of oppression and the need for us to be holistic, empowering, and decolonial in our approach to psychology. APA put out a book a couple of years ago on liberation psychology and recently released a book on decolonial psychology. Colonial or Western approaches to psychology overemphasize the individual and systemically neglect attending to the impact of racism and other forms of oppression on people's lives individually and collectively. Decolonizing psychology is about contextualizing it so that we can actively disrupt oppression. Colonial psychology centers the theories of white men and marginalizes the contributions of Black, Indigenous, people of color, and women's wisdom in the field of psychology. So for those of you who are educators, I invite you to check your curriculum. And this is not a matter of tokenism that I just need to add some other authors because I'm doing them a favor. But if we are talking about a psychology for all people, it will need to be a psychology from all people. And there is great scholarship that has been done that has been routinely marginalized, dishonored, and disregarded. To indigenize psychology is to center the knowledge, wisdom, and healing approaches developed by BIPOC and to shift from false notions of clinical neutrality to active opposition to oppression. Liberation psychology overlaps with many other psychologies, African-centered psychology, feminist psychology, and social justice-oriented psychotherapies, to name a few. There is also the realities of multicultural feminist psychology, recognizing that that is more than an orientation. It is more a life ethic, a foundation, manifesto, a value, an ever-present priority in the work that you do. So we want to approach our recognition of intersectionality, recognizing multiple marginalized identities, personally and professionally, in all of the work that we do. As we consider multiple marginalized identities, I invite you to learn more about womanist and mujerista psychologies. So womanist psychologies are born from the experiences of Black women. Mujerista psychologies come from Latinx women. We come with our own things. There's a name, Ntozake Shange, and Ntozake Shange means she who comes with her own things. And so that means that we are more than a modification. And modifications of treatment models are fine, but they are not the only option that we have. There are additional interventions that were actually created with the communities in mind, that were created with the experiences of women in mind. And so we want to attend to those, not simply having add-ons or modifications to models that were created without the population in mind. As we consider gendered racism, we want to think about consciousness raising. the importance for when we utilize psychoeducation. A part of psychoeducation is consciousness raising of the client or patient for them to be able to advocate for themselves, for them to be able to understand the systems and the impact of those systems on their lives, and to recognize the structural realities that are influencing their life experience. So a simple example is around eating disorders, that if we are addressing eating disorders and body image issues by only thinking about the trauma history of the individual or the eating habits of their parents or peers, but we are missing what are the messages that we are bombarded with about what is beautiful, what is desirable, what is attractive, then we are providing a fractioned reality that can result in a lot of victim blaming, where the idea is you have these challenges only because of your cognitive distortions. And so if we don't ask the question, where are these cognitions coming from? How are they being perpetuated and promoted? Then we are not fully engaged in prevention. So we want to think about how we can be affirmative in our self-definition and encourage clients to get to a place of self-affirmation, acceptance, validation, even as we consider mindfulness approaches of what does self-compassion without judgment look like. Community support, spirituality, integration of the expressive arts, and it's very key, especially as we think about health, that the absence of disease is not the same thing as health. Likewise, for those who are practitioners, symptom cessation is not our final goal, right? We are often trained by insurance companies and our educational programs to simply list the presenting problem. And when the problem has decreased or gone away, then our work is done. But all of us who really are honest about ourselves and those we work with recognize you can have symptom cessation and still have no peace, right? So you may have stopped cutting. You may have no suicide gestures and still have no sense of joy, no sense of purpose. So we want to think about healing and wellness and flourishing and growth. Along those lines, a big part of womanist and mujerista psychologies is not just teaching people to cope, but thinking about resistance strategies. So how do you push back against internalized oppression? How do you push back against oppression and discrimination when it is coming from your doctors, your nurses, when it is coming from your educational system? And so this idea of empowerment, advocacy, and activism is so essential to our work and understanding of what is wholeness. So womanism, when we really celebrate our identities and the identities of our communities, can be a protective factor. So an awareness of intersectional oppression was found to be a protective factor for women of color, moderating the relationship between experiences of racial and gender discrimination and distress. Similar findings were found with sexual minority women of color for lifetime sexism, but not for recent sexism. Self-esteem and ethnic identity strength serve as buffers between racism and distress for women of color. So awareness raising or consciousness raising is therapeutic. Not only are those pieces therapeutic, but cultural awareness and a positive gender identity is also therapeutic. That it is healing when in the midst of all of the silencing and marginalization, I am able to carve out and protect a positive sense of myself, not as an exception to like not in spite of being woman or not in spite of being Black, but that those things are a part of the affirmation of my identity. And that gives psychological, emotional benefits for our well-being. We also want to know that sexism and racism are interrelated. Historical and contemporary use of protective paternalism by white men toward white women was used to justify and fuel racism and xenophobia. So the arguments that have been used where we promote the idea that Black and brown men are the primary source of violence or danger, that is used to fuel injustices in our criminal justice processes. These are promoted and disseminated in the media. And even in my research around sexual assault, when I share that you're more likely to be assaulted by someone of your same background on these college campuses, a lot of times I get pushback or questions because people have been taught who they are to fear, and that the persons they are to fear are presented as Black and brown men. So we want to think about who gets harmed by these narratives and who gets protected by these narratives. White men who in an experiment read about violent crime report increased paternalism, benevolent sexism, the belief that they needed to protect white women. And this is related to higher anti-Black racism and negative perceptions of immigrants. And we have seen, even on a governmental level, the promotion of these myths and then the impact when we think about xenophobia and discriminatory policies. So we think also about the role of white women in this dynamic and the importance of encouraging people to have voice. Because if we are silent and passively accept or actively encourage the idea that we have to be protected from people of color, then that promotes these notions of racism. So the book came out around white fragility. And what that book is about is basically emotional capacity to hear other people's wounds, right? The emotional capacity, maturity, and will to hear other people's pain, as opposed to when people share their pain, saying that I don't feel safe or I'm uncomfortable or what about my wounds? So each of us want to be really mindful of our capacity to sit with and be in solidarity and support with each other, right? So for a parallel, for an example, if I went to an LGBTQ training as a straight Black woman, can you imagine if in the middle of their training, as they're talking about the challenges, if I became tearful and upset and said like, well, what about me and all of my pain? So it is problematic when we cannot sit and hear each other so that we can actually be in solidarity and support. So racism and sexism shows up in the workplace in various ways, and we want to be tuned into the impact of stress at work, and people have taken to using the word toxic workplaces. So we want to think about the consequences of those on our bodies, and we want to consider the consequences on our mental health, the financial costs as well, and think about the disparities that exist as it relates to women with high risk of sexual harassment, sexual assault. We also want to think about being overworked and underpaid. We want to consider what the impact is in terms of lack of promotion and lack of validation of the work that is being done. And that I want to name across the SES spectrum. It also shows up for our doctoral students. Not sure if we have any graduate students present, but in research looking at their experiences of racism and sexism within their programs, they talk about covert, overt, physical, and material experiences, and as a result, feeling defensive, feeling they have to control themselves, feeling that they have to direct their path in particular ways. It is so important that we have mentorship and support networks, and that's why allyship is so important. That even if we are not from the same identity, that we can choose to show up in support of each other. And so I'm excited about the men who are present on today, who saw the topic of advocating for women and said, yes, I want to be here. And I want to be mindful about the ways in which our responses to these experiences in the present can then shape how we respond in the future. So if we are told to just be silent and endure, then people will often say, wait till you get out of graduate school. Well, wait till you get tenure track. Well, wait till you get tenured. So now you're talking about expecting someone to be silenced until many years into a process which may be unsustainable to them. And it also then falls on those of us who have more years or power in associations to be willing to be the voice and to advocate and to speak up. So society asks, what's wrong with you? Trauma-informed practitioners say, what happened to you? Culturally aware trauma-informed practitioners say, what happened to you and to your peoples or communities, and what continues to happen? And then from a liberation standpoint, what happened? And then how do we honor your ancestral wisdom to heal? How do we honor what you come with and what you know in order to move not only to surviving, but also to thriving? So I developed a model with Dr. Ocampo on healing racial trauma, and it is about acknowledging the wounds that people have experienced, creating a space where people can share as we think about a narrative approach, building trust, not only how do I determine who I can trust outside of me, within my community, within other communities, but also how I can develop trust for myself when I have been bombarded with these messages. You know, we often go based on the evidence, and the evidence of violation and discrimination over time often can lead people to feel unworthy. So we're needing to heal that, which is then connected to internalized racism and internalized sexism. So internalized oppression is when you come to believe the lies you've been told about yourself. So when I hear women say things like, I don't like to make friends with women because women are petty. It's like, whoa. So when you dislike the group that you are a part of because of some stereotype or myth that would say, so all men are deep and all women are shallow, so that's why I can't be friends with women. So we want to be intentional about addressing internalized oppression, grieving the losses, including the health losses of what did discrimination and stigma take from us, having space for people to be able to voice their anger. And Judith Herman talks about constructive versus destructive anger, so that for many people who work for change, their anger was a part of what motivated them to say, this is outrageous. We have to work to make things better. Working on coping strategies, and then as I added the important distinction between traditional trauma recovery models and liberation-oriented models is the resistance strategies. So encouraging people to explore their voice and their options and their agencies in order to be able to fight back. So individually with women, we think about those coping strategies like journaling, expressive art, spirituality, not only social support, but community support. So you really want to make a note of that. There is big critique of when we only promote self-care, because self-care puts all of the weight on the individual when they are often trying to navigate systems that are unfair. So it is important that we think about community support, collective support, social support, in addition to the self-care. How do we care for each other as a community? And then we consider that there are multiple models to healing and addressing trauma. When I started doing a lot of these presentations during the pandemic, people would say things like, it sounds like you all need a model. So there are many models. They have often not been taught or disseminated in our various training programs, but we want to be mindful and intentional about learning them. One such model is my Resist to Rise Womanish Trauma Informed Group. This article was recently published in Women in Therapy, I believe on last year. So when we think of indigenizing psychology, we want to consider that women come with various ways of healing, and we want to learn how to incorporate those, to respect those, and to know that for a lot of our histories, that we recognized that justice was therapeutic. And so an indigenous approach to healing is truth telling and seeking justice, in addition to aromatherapy or massage or journaling. And so using our voices as a collective is very important as we think about not only dismantling and disrupting oppression, but liberation is about imagining and building something new. So not only do I want to interrupt oppression, but I invite you to think about what is health and wholeness and wellness for all women and for women and girls. What does that look like? And then how will I apply my psychological science to allowing that picture to become manifested in our reality? I am so grateful for our time together. And I want to say there are many ways that we can resist. Oppression is interdisciplinary, so to combat it, we have to be interdisciplinary. We need to work across generations. And so I am so glad for you all to have students, early career, mid-career, and our senior professionals as well. I am appreciative of those who are engaged in protest and marches. And I want to say that is important work, and that is not the only path to transformation. So some of you will work directly in advocacy around policy and legislation. Some of you hopefully will think about running for office, whether that is running for office within your division or within APA or within the government. We can also think about resistance strategies in our parenting and how we raise children and teach children to be advocates for themselves and for each other. We can advocate and resist in our teaching, our research, and our practice, and ensuring that we're not engaging in tokenism and silencing of marginalized voices. And then I want to tell you that resistance is not just our labor, it is not just our outrage, but it's an act of radical revolutionary resistance for you to rest, for you to have joy, for you to have love, humor, solidarity, positive body image, feeling sex positive, reconnected to the sacred, healing, organizing, envisioning, and manifesting are all acts of advocacy and resistance, and we are worthy of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bryant. And I am writing down notes as fast as possible for all those
Good.
action points. I want to open it up to the group on questions. You can put in the chat, you can raise your hand. I know it's always a tough transition to go from presentation to then interaction.
And I did skip a slide, so if there's not a question, I can talk.
Tracy Franklin says, I don't even have words. I'm so grateful to have listened to you and learned from you today.
Oh, you are welcome. And I'll say unless you get another question, I'm just going to address what was on the slide I skipped. What are some of the barriers for us doing this advocacy work? One is the myth that says that that it's not professional, right? So some people say, like, I want to be a scientist, I don't want to be political. Well, the reality is what we study has policy implications. And when we think about our responsibility to use our science for the improvement of people's lives, so if harm is being done, we have a responsibility to acknowledge that and hopefully to also be a part of the solution. So I would encourage people to release the idea that professionalism means silence, and that silence is somehow neutral. I want to let you know neutrality supports the status quo. So if you don't speak, it is supporting whatever is already happening. So the way systems are already created, silence lets them continue. Your silence is a vote of confidence for what is. So if you see that things need to shift or change or transform in some ways, then it's important to lend your voice to that. And if you are supportive of some things that are happening, and we have research to support that this is a good way that we're doing things, then it's important to talk about that. Let me also say that some people are silent because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. And, so they don't want to be labeled or get in trouble. And I want to say, when you are attempting to speak up or engage, especially in a new area, you're going to get it wrong. So as opposed to I have to avoid it because I'm going to mess up, in mindfulness, we call it beginner's mind, right? Am I willing to be curious? Am I willing to show up even when I'm not the expert? Am I willing to learn and to be taught? And then am I willing to take correction? So let's say you decide to engage, and then someone says that you said something wrong or you framed something wrong. Instead of like freezing and retreating, then I say thank you, right? Like, okay, like going forward now, I understand that, or get to a place of understanding. So I hope you will not let the myth of professionalism or fear of mistakes keep you from participating.
Because there are a few more minutes and because Dr. Hood and I, and honestly, a lot of the people in this group talk about this a lot, it is that position piece without implementation or that anti-oppression work we talk about a lot and find that it's really hard to move from that talking space to that action point. And we find ourselves often fumbling in the action stages because we don't know the system or we don't know the right ways to approach the system, and get a lot of pushback with regardless if it's within our work as a group or our work individually. And so that filling the cup piece that you hit on with that rest, joy, building community, and kind of rebuilding that energy is so important. But also, how do we keep leaning into that action when it feels like there's this wall that cannot be passed?
Yeah. And that is intentional, right? The wall is to keep you from acting. So so it is to feel the resistance, to feel the pushback. And I would say in our organizations, for me, it helps being a practitioner because I see some of the pushback as fear. So then when I recognize like you don't want us to do anything because you're afraid, right? Then I'm not gonna let your fear stop me, but I can respond to you in a way that is addressing like what's underneath that, right? Is the fear. For some people, it's not the fear, it is this their traditional training of that's not professional and we should remain professional. And so, I would point to the examples of, our advocacy office. And if our advocacy office didn't, we're like called upon where, congressional leaders are literally saying, we're grappling with something. Can you inform us? Right. So then then we're providing the information. So that is a prior worlds training, and it's understandable that it's disruptive for people who that's what they were taught, right? And so then we give them examples because often they think you're trying to lead them somewhere where nobody else is. So then it helps to see examples of what are other divisions doing? What is the association doing? And like, did the world fall apart when they did those things? No. And also, I think we release ourselves from perfectionism when we get held up because we think the one project has to solve it all. This will be one of many things we do. So this one doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to hit all 500 points, but this is what we're doing this month or this semester. And then we'll do something else like the next semester to build on it. And for the membership, people can attend what they want to attend. So if this isn't your thing and you'd rather us do these other things, then you don't have to attend this one.
I really like that. And we have a couple more minutes. We have a question. Do you have specific suggestions about how we can support our colleagues and collaborators in states where DEI and similar initiatives are being outlawed? And that is another thing we're grappling with a lot as a group and also society.
Yes, absolutely. So it is really important, and I'm glad that we're paying attention because it's a national plan. Like, this is not a fluke. This was strategic. It is organized. These are the states where they're starting. And the intention is to take that model and duplicate it across the country. So it is important that we become strategic. Like, I want to say people who think along those lines, however you want to label them, they fund law schools, right? They develop lawyers who will implement their plan. This is not conspiracy thinking. I'm saying because I know people within these programs who are tasked to do these things, okay? So we have to become intentional. So the response to that kind of strategy can't be neutrality. Right? If they're coming with a game plan and we're just showing up saying we're neutral, it's not going to work. So us being strategically, and I love the work that's being done with several labs looking at disseminating their findings through blogs, through social media, getting it to political leaders. So we have the science that counters what they're pushing for. We have the science. And so then, but if the science is only in our journals, it's not doing anything. So then it is getting that information into now, no, there are going to be people who both are enemies of science and people who won't believe it, even if you show them the results. But then there are other people who are caught up, confused, uninformed. And so those are the people that you're trying to get the information to.
Thank you so much. And this was amazing. And I hope this is just a beginning of a conversation that we can continue to have within our divisions, across divisions, because there's so much important work to do. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Oh, and closing remarks. Remember, if you would like C credit for attending this event, please respond promptly to the evaluation link, which will be sent via email shortly. We will leave the evaluation open until Thursday, May 18th, 2023. And C certificates will be sent via email within 5 to 10 business days after the evaluation period closes. Remember, you're encouraged to submit an evaluation, even if not seeking credit. Please remember to join or renew now to be eligible for future free SFHP benefits and programs. And feel free to email us at div38@verizon.net if you have any questions. And again, thank you to Dr. Bryant for an amazing presentation, and thank you to the audience. And we're hoping to have more of these in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me. You all take good care.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Bryant. Really heartfelt appreciation.
Oh,
Thank